listener production.
Hey, Chris Spiro with you. Happy Friday. Welcome to The Briefing. Two national shows got the axe this week, and while they couldn't have been more different, both were once bold bets on the future of current affairs TV.
Anyone under 50 is kind of treated as an afterthought and given these very kind of small, cheap products, but they were the last genuine attempts to invest big time in those audiences.
That deep dive into the cancellation of the Project and Q+A is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Friday, the 13th of June.
Hey Chris, and to you listening. We're starting in India, where authorities have confirmed there's been just one survivor of a plane crash that's killed at least 290 people in the country's west. The Air India flight was headed for London when it crashed shortly after takeoff in Ahmedabad. There were 242 people on board.
Footage of the crash shows the plane lifting off before rapidly losing altitude and plunging into a residential area, sending flames and thick smoke billowing into the sky. According to reports, the plane had only reached an altitude of around 190 metres, with the pilot issuing a mayday call before losing contact. A number of students were killed when the plane crashed onto the medical college hostel where they were staying, with at least 50 others being treated in hospital.
The British national that survived the crash, Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, was in a window seat towards the front of the plane and says he doesn't know how he's alive, telling local media he heard a loud bang before seeing pieces of the plane around him. The 40-year-old had been visiting relatives in India and was returning home to the UK, with his brother also on the flight.
Yeah, and we've heard from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who called the crash heartbreaking beyond words, while Anthony Albanese posted to social media last night saying it was absolutely devastating. The UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has also spoken since it was confirmed 53 British nationals were on board.
Well, the images and news from India is absolutely devastating, and I speak for the entire country in saying our thoughts are with each and every one of those involved. There will be British and Indian families across the land who are absolutely impacted.
Emergency crews are still at the scene and an investigation is underway, the UK joining those, while crisis centres have been opened for families of those impacted.
There's been no official word yet on what caused the crash. There has been one aviation expert that's come out and said there's a chance that it could have been pilot error, given the plane sunk and didn't swing side to side before plummeting, and if it had, that would have suggested mechanical error, apparently.
Yeah, we've also learned that the plane had been in Australia just 4 days earlier, in Melbourne specifically, and had then gone to New Delhi before going to Paris, Tokyo, and then Ahmedabad. It was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner and was more than 11 years old, so of average age, and was due for a midlife refurb. And it is worth noting that this all comes around a year after a former Boeing engineer had urged the company to ground all 787 Dreamliners, alleging unsafe assembly practices and shortcuts led to structural flaws.
To the US, where Donald Trump's decision to send troops to LA to quell anti-ICE protests is set to be challenged in a federal court today. It comes after the California governor, Gavin Newsom, filed an emergency motion earlier this week, claiming the decision to bring in 4,000 members of the National Guard and 700 US Marines crosses legal limits on military involvement in civil matters.
Governor Newsom, as well as LA Mayor Karen Bass, have been locked into a war of words with the US president this week over his response to the anti-ICE protests in the city, with his Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth just hours ago refusing to say whether he or the Trump administration would follow the court's ruling.
We should not have local judges determining foreign policy or national security policy for the country.
It comes as immigration raids as well as protests continue across parts of the US.
A dual Australian and Nigerian citizens facing charges including human trafficking and deceptive recruitment after allegedly luring a group of Papua New Guinea nationals to work in Australia under the guise of fake scholarships. Self-described professor 56-year-old Binta Abu Bakar is accused of promising 15 people free education and the ability to build a dream career before forcing them to work on farms in Queensland's southeast against their will. Australian Federal Police Detective Superintendent Adrian Telfer says what they've endured is disturbing.
They are pursuing an education, a dream, several living in a shipping container. They're being driven long distances, some in the boot of a car.
It's alleged the 56-year-old was receiving wages on the group's behalf and would threaten them with deportation if they didn't cooperate. The AFP say they began investigating Abu Bakar after a tip-off from Queensland Police, and she was arrested on Wednesday after departing a flight in Brisbane. She fronted court the same day, where she was granted conditional bail and is next due to front court in September.
The country's health ministers are set to meet today to discuss how to better regulate Australia's fertility industry after a second embryo mix-up by Monash IVF. The fertility providers had to apologise after transferring the incorrect embryo to one of its patients for the second time in 2 months.
Back in April, it admitted to mistakenly implanting one patient with another person's embryo, while in an incident revealed this week, a woman's embryo was transferred instead of her partner's.
Monash IVF's CEO has since resigned over the incidents, but Victoria's health minister says it's not enough and further action is needed. Advocates are now demanding strict national regulations and also urging all children born through assisted reproduction to get DNA tested. Now, federal and state health ministers will meet in Melbourne today with the IVF sector on the agenda, including whether national accreditation and a licensing scheme is needed for providers.
And we wanted to finish off this week hearing from you guys, our listeners. We asked you on Instagram on our broadcast channel Behind the Briefing what TV shows should have never been axed on the back end of the project's axing, and you gave us a bunch of shows. Yes, shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine were fan favourites for our briefers, as was Big Door Prize, Hannibal, Firefly, Lost, and London Spy, which I've never heard of or seen anywhere.
Yeah, as this one, Schmidt-a-Goon, but I have heard Sense8. Hey, it's Saturday. Someone said, Chris, you said The Charmed reboot.
Yes, I did.
But a very popular answer was The Masked Singer. Apparently I have to eat my words. The Santa Clarita Diet, and my absolute favourite show of all time, Mindhunter. It is actually the best. It's based around that bloke who started the FBI's first ever behavioural science unit and the first people to interview serial killers to understand their psyche. You can obviously tell I'm a big true crime buff.
Yeah, this is very, very on brand for you, Tara Cassidy. Hey, look, that brings our headlines to a close. Up next is my deep dive, looking into what or who killed the Project and Q+A. Stick around, that chat is coming up for you next. The Project and Q+A have been axed, and while news of their cancellations sent the news world and mainstream media into meltdown, I'm curious to know, do you care?
Oh, I do care a little bit. Yeah, The Project. Used to watch that heaps.
I personally don't care about Q&A.
The Project I do care about because I think it was a great way to actually digest news.
Q&A honestly hits me a bit harder. I think just it's really important to have that public access broadcasting angle and just allowing the people to have a chance to learn about topics they might not be across.
Channel 10's The Project kicked off in 2009, aired nightly, and was pitched at younger audiences, blending headlines with humour, irreverence, and celebrity sparkle. The ABC's Q&A. It premiered the year earlier, ran weekly, and was aimed at a wider, more intergenerational audience, bringing together politicians, experts, students, and everyday Aussies for live, often fiery debates. But what led to their demise, and how did these once staples of nighttime telly end up on the chopping block? Hunter Smith is the former head writer and supervising producer of The Project, and Scott Mitchell is a former ABC producer and host of independent podcast Lamestream. They both join me now. Hunter, Scott, welcome to the briefing. Hunter, I'll start with you since it copped the axe first. Can you set the scene for us? How important was a show like The Project when it first aired?
Oh, look, for me, the show was really important, really groundbreaking, really broke the molds. And, for all the obvious reasons, it was brand new. It was a unique mix of news and comedy and entertainment. But I also think that in terms of the way it presented well-known Australian talent, that was really groundbreaking too. You know, I think it was one of the first shows, or certainly of the era, that showed that funny people can be smart and that smart people can be funny. And then from then, they really built on that. I think in the early days, it was quite light, but then over time, it became more comfortable with tackling really big issues. And then, you know, for the last decade or so, it's been the only space on commercial TV where you would hear from certain sections of society, marginalised people doing it tough, that sort of thing. And yeah, there's nowhere else on TV where that audience was getting those stories.
Scott, we'll dip our toe now into ABC land. The day after the project announced that it would be leaving our TV screens, we then heard reports about Q&A, and then, you know, the formal announcement came out that Q&A would also be leaving our TV screens, won't be returning. Set the scene for us there. How important was a show like Q&A?
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine now because it's fallen to such low viewership. But it's hard to explain that at one time it was a genuine federal political news story what politicians wore on that show, let alone what they said. Like when Malcolm Turnbull went on in a leather jacket, that was like a 2-week political story about whether this was him pushing towards the leadership, him as this cool, slick guy. And it was a genuine national conversation point that, you know, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age ran live blogs. Every website in the country did wrap-up pieces of what everyone said on it. And yeah, it sort of is a remarkable kind of fall from grace to get where it is. I will just quickly add to Hunter's point on the project that over at the ABC, we were also watching the launch of the project with incredible interest because we were in about 3 weeks' time about to launch another youth current affairs show called Hungry Beast that lasted a lot less time than the project did. But I just was thinking about this week because I was like, can you imagine two major Australian TV networks both launching current affairs shows specifically designed for younger audiences and investing in big teams, big productions to do that? Whereas now I think, you know, anyone under 50 is kind of treated as an afterthought and given these very kind of small, cheap products. But they were kind of the last genuine attempts to invest big time in those audiences.
Yeah, well, it brings us to today. I'll fast forward us nearly 2 decades on. Both these shows have now been axed. Hunter, I'll get your thoughts on this. Why do you think the project's been axed?
We saw in some of the reported comments from the 10 execs that, you know, it's about shifting audiences. The project was aimed always at a younger audience. I think it evolved over time. I think we worked really hard to match the aging audience. It certainly wasn't the same show that launched 16 years ago that'll finish up in 3 weeks. But the truth is those people just aren't watching television anymore. And unfortunately, there's just no news content on streaming. There's certainly very little Australian content on streaming. And I can't think of a single, outside of some reality dating shows, with no unscripted stuff on streaming. But I will add, you know, that the project's online presence is far and away the most successful of any Australian news program. So the sort of numbers that the project can rack up every day on YouTube and Instagram primarily is staggering. So you could argue that the exact same people are watching the project, they're just watching it a completely different way. But as we all know, the issues with monetizing that are completely different format. And so I think it's a very big ask for us to hold television network to flip to being, you know, a social media company essentially. So yeah, that's what did it in the end.
Scott, we'll talk about Q&A. What do you think's behind this axing?
I think the show was on life support for a long time for a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously the ratings fell off a cliff to the point where, you know, that Monday night for the ABC was a huge tent pole always. It was, you know, like Q&A, Four Corners, Media Watch. It was a huge block that drew huge ratings, and Q&A used to kind of boost that and prop up those other shows. Now it's well behind that and people are actually kind of skipping Q&A. They stripped back the scheduling of it this year to only be on parliamentary sitting weeks, which is an insane programming choice. I don't know what regular person is sitting around looking at their calendar for parliamentary sitting weeks to know when Q&A is going to be on. So I think that foreshadowed that it was always going to go. I actually think the timing of it is that actually the sad thing is they probably saved the axing for this week, knowing they were going to do it for ages, because they also fired, they've let go of 50 jobs this week. And I think they put out that Q&A announcement to suck some oxygen away from that.
Do you think there's a different argument to be made there? Like, is it important that Q&A does rate really important, or does it cross into more sort of public service television where an organisation like the ABC, could see it as part of their charter to have a place where politicians answer questions from the public?
I think the ABC always wanted to kind of control the questions from the audience and be quite cautious with what they put to air, and that meant that you never got as much spontaneity and kind of back and forth between politicians and the audience as would be best. So I do think there is a really good point there of, should the ABC just go, well, it's our charter to engage the public with politicians and force politicians to engage with the public, and let's find a better way of doing this that works. I think that's a really good point.
Do you think these cancellations represent a shift in the mainstream media?
I think we're definitely seeing a shift in the news space particularly. I talked about ageing audiences. I've seen some research that suggests that the average age of the people who watch the ABC 7 o'clock news, the average age is between 70 and 80. So the ages that we're dealing with here are quite surprising to a lot of people. And so I think this shows a shift, as Scott mentioned earlier, that in terms of a news product, the networks are shifting away from younger people and are just going to focus on older demographics. And who can blame them? When they look at the numbers and they look at the money, who can blame them? I don't think that, networks are giving up on youth programming. I think a lot of dating shows, reality formats, I think they're still skewed equally younger, because I think those programs are able to derive a strong enough audience on streaming. But once you move into the news platform, I often think of a news program like you might be its biggest fan, but if you miss a Wednesday night episode because you were out late, you're probably unlikely to stream it before Thursday's episode comes around. You know what I mean? You miss one episode, that's fine.
I also think it signals a shift away from kind of big, bold swings. I think both shows, when they were commissioned, were really innovative formats that nothing like them existed. And you look at what 10 is going to replace the project with, and we haven't seen an episode yet, but it's been mentioned as kind of like 60 Minutes, kind of like A Current Affair, kind of like 7:30. For a network like 10, which is always, I've associated with The Simpsons and with The Project and with things that are kind of a bit different and counterculture, it signals kind of a doing what everyone else is doing. And I think similarly at the ABC, I wouldn't exclude the ABC from that. Big, bold swings, I think, are out. I think both shows were so attacked by the kind of very right wing in Australia as kind of being too woke, and they both, Waleed Ali copped horrendous criticism. Every host of Q&A has copped criticism. And I think they both kind of got in their head a bit about that. Not their fault, but I think they tried to correct for that criticism and ended up in a place where it felt like they weren't really for anyone because they were trying to please everybody. And I think that the networks won't take this lesson, but I think I will take this lesson as death, I think, in modern media is not having a perspective or trying to be for absolutely everybody.
Okay, so it sounds like edgy or news for young people on TV at least is on the way out. What challenges does that present, though, for us as consumers when the news that we're getting doesn't have all the bumpers and balances and checks that comes with the news produced in mainstream settings?
I think so. I mean, we're all familiar now with the power of the algorithms that control us, right? So even with something like The Project, you might not watch it online, but The Project's putting out a range of views, a range of stories, a range of presenters every night that may come across your social media feed. So you are still getting that sort of externally curated list of stories that should be interesting. And I know there are a lot of great independent media organizations popping up, but there's a lot of dodgy ones too. Like people might not know that a show like The Project, it might present itself pretty casual, but of course it was really and is really buttoned up on the facts. There's a fact checker. There's people whose job it is to make sure that what goes out is as accurate as possible. We are in an age where those sort of things that we rely on are crumbling, and you see it in the way that you speak to people. People will present to you something that they've seen that was clickbait, and they'll present it to you as fact. And I think I'm not saying that The Project was the last great bastion of journalism, but it's certainly a step on the way down, isn't it? On the way down to hell.
Scott, I'll get your read on this because you're playing in this space and you're doing an incredibly good job at it. You aren't one of those examples of people that are spreading disinformation. You are bringing quality journalism to the table.
That's kind, Chris. That's kind. I hope I earn that trust.
What's your read on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, even though I'm independent, I'm rooting for the big media companies to do better. I'll say that to this exact conversation, Like we reported yesterday that these job cuts at the ABC are targeted at digital journalists. So you have this odd situation where the axing of Q&A doesn't seem to be leading to sort of more investment from somewhere like the ABC in digital journalism that speaks to people online. So I'm rooting for those major networks to pivot successfully, to bring that quality to online news as look, they already have, there's some great journalism that's done on the ABC News website, at say The Guardian, still at the 9 newspapers. There is great stuff being done. I think we could all agree that those places could do much better at reaching people. And I think in terms of the independent stuff that's popping up, there are definitely less scrupulous and more scrupulous people in that. My hope is that we kind of apply scrutiny to the independent space. It's going to be really hard to navigate this space. In some ways, independent voices, I think, can report on stories that big corporations can decide not to for various reasons, for various profit motives. But there are also huge misinformation risks, huge things like that. So I think it's just applying a standard, both as an audience member, as other media professionals in this space. It's taking a close look, calling out people when they kind of get things wrong or don't fact check something, and hoping that lifts all boats and it lifts the standard.
Hunter Smith, Scott Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me on The Briefing.
Thanks, Chris.
Great conversation.
That was former head writer and supervising producer of The Project, Hunter Smith, and former ABC producer and host of the podcast Lamestream, speaking with me there. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. We would love to know your thoughts on this. Did news of the cancellations surprise you? Do you care? Make sure you get in touch with us in the comments section or head to our Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Chris Spiru. I'll catch you next time.
Listener.